I dread to think how long this video is going to be, and if you have clicked on this video and committed to watching it, thank you, you're my favourite. I think April was possibly my biggest reading month of all time. I read over 20 books in April. The last time I did that was in December, when I had like 3 weeks off work, and I think in April I've probably read more pages than I did in December. I don't know how I've done this, I really don't. So please, get yourself a cup of tea, get yourself a snack. If you're new here, hi, I'm Leanne, I talk about books, and today I talk about a lot of books. Why didn't I do a mid-month wrap-up? Like, why didn't I do that? I can't afford to be doing this much faffing around. I need to get into the reviews. Let's start with the fiction for grown-ups. Then we'll do non-fiction, we will do kids' books and like some kids' picture books in there as well. At some point we'll do a pit stop for some poetry. First book I read in the month was How Do You Like Me Now by Holly Bourne. It feels like forever ago that I read this book, and that's kind of how I feel about all of my reading this month. Like, it feels like it has been a really long month. I feel like I read this ages ago. So How Do You Like Me Now is about a woman named Tori who has previously written this best-selling memoir. A memoir that was all about like being a young woman, about fighting against the patriarchy, kind of essentially about like being a badass bitch. But you see the reality of her life in that she's not even really taking her own advice from that book. The relationship that she has with her boyfriend is not healthy, and I would give a content warning for this book in that there is a scene where something happens between Tori and her boyfriend where even she's not really fully sure if she consented to what happened, so just a content warning for that. The book is also about the differences between Tori and her friends, you know, the complications in her friendships with women in her life who have started to like settle down and have kids, and the book really explores that dynamic of being outwardly a like really strong woman, but actually behind closed doors she's dealing with a lot of insecurity and a lot of difficulty in her life. I really related to a lot of the concerns that Tori has in this regard, and I also really enjoyed the exploration of Tori as a person who has written quite a personal memoir and then has expectations on her shoulders to repeat that same success. I think this book does a really fantastic job of showcasing a lot of the concerns that women have when they are on the cusp of their 30s, and it also explores quite a toxic relationship with social media as well. I would really highly recommend this book. I think everything that Holly Bourne writes tends to be fantastic. I have so many more books from her on my TBR as well, and I always feel like I'm in such safe hands with Holly's writing. Like, I know I'm gonna have a great reading experience. In April I also read Everything Under by Daisy Johnson, and unfortunately this was a book that just wasn't for me. It was a book that I could really appreciate, that I think was fantastically written. I think a lot of it just kind of went over my head. Either I wasn't in the right headspace for it, or I'm just not the right reader for it. This book is about a lexicographer called Gretel who had quite a strange childhood. She lived on a houseboat with her mother. They grew up wandering around canals. They had their own secret language. But then Gretel's mother abandoned her and she was in foster care. When we're following Gretel in the present day, she receives a phone call from her mother, and it leads her down this path of unraveling her childhood and her history and recovering buried memories. As I said, this one just wasn't really for me. I don't know if it was the writing style or the fact that this is a myth retelling, and that's not always an area that I feel fully comfortable in. I think a lot of this book potentially went over my head. The book explores a lot of things around gender and identity politics, the ideas of nature versus nurture, which are all things that I'm really interested in, and I wanted to connect to this book in some way because they are themes that I'm interested in, but I couldn't connect to it. I think if you enjoy Angela Carter's writing or Kirsty Logan's writing, then you would really like this book. But with both of those writers as well, I have had reading experiences where I'm like, I want to enjoy this more than I am. So yeah, this was a bit of a weird reading experience for me. I also read The Foundling by Sarah Halls. This is a proof copy from last year, so I feel kind of bad that I'm only just getting around to reading it now. But this book was such a pleasant surprise for me. I am not hugely into historical fiction at all, so I had quite moderate expectations going into this book, and I thought it was really fantastic. So this is set in the 1700s, and it follows what happens when a young woman has a child and realizes that she cannot afford to take care of this child properly, and she takes her to the Foundling Hospital, which is essentially a place where children will be cared for until a parent is able to come back to the hospital and like reclaim their child if they are able to pay for the care that their child has received for however long they've been there. And our main character's child has, according to her, been here for 6 years. And our main character has a much more stable life now than she had when she first had the child 6 years on, and she is ready to be a mother to this child. But when she goes to the Foundling Hospital, she is told that someone claimed the child a day after she dropped her off there, and thus begins her journey to try and find out what happens to her child. There were elements of the plotline in this book that I found a little bit too convenient, but nonetheless I enjoyed going through the process of unraveling this mystery. And I think what I really enjoyed about this book was the Georgian London setting. I think that was evoked so superbly, and I really enjoyed watching the dynamic in the relationships between all of the women in this book. And the book does explore a lot of things around womanhood and motherhood, the conditions of women in Georgian London and women from different social standings. On the surface, this doesn't seem like it would be a book that I would massively love, and for that reason I was just really pleasantly surprised by how much I did enjoy it. I also read The Glass Hotel by Emily St. John Mandel. I have had quite a hit or miss relationship with books by this author. I really loved Station 11, I didn't really love the Lola Quartet, and I had quite a strange relationship with this book as well. There is so much going on in this book, and it's difficult to kind of give you a neat summary of what the plot is. Near the beginning of this book, there is quite a dramatic event that is kind of the point that is a catalyst for a lot of different tangential stories. So on the window of a hotel in a very remote location in Canada, someone writes a message on one of the windows saying, "Why don't you swallow broken glass?" And the book follows a number of people who are in that hotel or are somehow linked to people in this hotel, and paints a really broad picture of these characters' lives. It's told in a way that isn't fully linear. We are jumping around in time, we are jumping around with characters, and I think the way the author achieves that, and it being done so seamlessly, was incredibly impressive. The other kind of dramatic catalyst in this book is a Ponzi scheme, and again how that affects all of the different characters that are related to the person at the epicenter of it. And it's very strange. I would say this book is a superbly told novel about something that isn't that interesting. Like the Ponzi scheme stuff, like I don't find that interesting at all, but I was just so impressed by how the author handled all of these different characters who made them all feel fully fleshed out. Emily St. John Mandel has this incredible way of changing your perspective of something in just one sentence, in giving us so much information about a particular character with just a few words. I think how she balanced all of these different things that are going on in this book, all of the different characters and directions in their lives, how she manages to give you information at the exact point it will be the most interesting, is just so incredibly done. I find it so strange how she made something that I was not interested in. I am not interested in a collapse of a Ponzi scheme. How she made it so interesting and thrilling. I actually think this is a book that the longer I spend away from it, the more I like it, because it's one that has just really stayed with me. Next I have two books that I'm going to talk about together because they are a duology. So I have Pages for You and Pages for Her, both by Sylvia Brownrigg. I find just kind of the history of these books and their publication really interesting. There's quite a significant gap in the publication between these two books. I think it's around like 20 years, but I might be making that up. So if you read the first book when it first came out, you had to wait ages to get the second part in the duology, but I read them one after the other. In the first book, we are following a female-female romance between Flannery and Anne. Flannery is 17. She's just started university, and Anne is a little bit older than her, actually quite significantly older than her. And because of that, I felt a little bit uncomfortable about the relationship between the two of them. But I do think that it's a relationship that a lot of people will be able to connect to, especially with a queer experience of having someone who is older than you kind of introducing you to lots of things about yourself. And I think the first book just really captures that feeling of completely falling for someone, of like having a romantic and sexual relationship with someone, but also just being very in awe of them. And again, I think that's an experience that a lot of us can relate to. And I think the author does an amazing job of putting things into words that I've never really been able to articulate before. The second book in the duology I didn't enjoy as much as the first. And it follows both of these women many years later. They are both, grown. And because of a university conference, they are brought back together again all of these years later. But a lot of this second book has to do with the relationships they had later on with men, their feelings around motherhood. In the second book, Flannery has a child, and I do think that was interesting, reading these books so close together and being able to see how much their lives changed in that space of time, but that they still had this incredible connection when they come together. I think both of these books were just a fantastic exploration of a blossoming love affair and the feeling of kind of delirium that you have in the midst of that. I do think they were both fantastic, but particularly the first one. In April, I also read The Vegetarian Tigers of Paradise by Crystal Jeans. This book follows a young girl as she grows up in Cardiff. And it's interesting because I wouldn't say this is a book that is particularly plot focused or story focused. We are just kind of watching this girl's life unfold. While it is a book about her childhood and adolescence, this is not a children's book at all. Some of the experiences that we follow her along are like really funny, and then some of them are like really touching. Some of them are really shocking. She experiences a lot of things around shame and being hurt. She does have a very difficult upbringing, and sometimes that was difficult to read about. But then something hilarious then happens. The voice that our main character Chrissy has is so distinctive and unique and feels so authentic to an actual person. One of the aspects I really enjoyed about this book was Chrissy kind of exploring her own sexuality, and there are definitely queer themes in this book. There's definitely something that's really gritty about this book as well. It's one that I haven't heard a lot of people talking about, and it's one that I really would recommend. Let's do the non-fiction now. I have 5 non-fiction books to talk to you about, 3 that I have physical copies of, and then 2 that I read digitally. So I'm going to start with What White People Can Do Next by Emma DeBerry. Emma is the author of my favourite non-fiction book of last year, Don't Touch My Hair. So when I found out she had a new book coming out, I immediately pre-ordered it. What White People Can Do Next is an extended essay that is split into different sections, where Emma is discussing racial injustice with a blend of her own personal experiences, but also an immense amount of research. There are elements of this book that are very academic. There were lots of parts of this book that I had to read a few times to kind of figure out exactly what Emma was saying to me and what exactly the research that she was talking about meant. But that is not a bad thing. You know, these are complicated issues that do take time to understand. I think if you are someone who has read a lot of books around racism, like Rennie Lodge's book, maybe books like Uncomfortable Conversations with a Black Man, and you are looking something to read next, to do next, I would really recommend this book. But when you're reading this, you really do need to do the work. A lot of this book is also focused on interrogating capitalism and how that is linked to racial inequality. I would also really recommend reading this book quite soon if it's something that you want to read. I think it's a book that's really important for white people to read because she is talking about really contemporary things. You know, she is talking about COVID in this book. She is talking about George Enchenko, who was a black man who was killed by Irish police officers, or Gardaí as we call them here, which I think is something that didn't really get any news coverage outside of Ireland. Really important, phenomenally written book, but one that you will probably have to and should take your time reading. I also read It's Not About the Burka, which is edited by Mariam Khan, and this is a collection of lots of different essays on a really broad range of topics from lots of different Muslim women. The idea behind this collection of essays is to give voice to Muslim women who are so often spoken over or spoken on behalf of. The women in this collection are exploring Islamophobia, misogyny, the intersection between those two. They are talking about oppression and lazy stereotyping. They are talking about queer identity and sex. They are talking about divorce. They are talking about falling in love. They are talking about feminism. They are talking about the fashion industry. They are talking about being in STEM, in careers that are dominated by men. In each of these essays, I learned something new. I saw a different perspective. And I think it's so important to listen to all of the different voices that are in this essay collection. I also read Hormonal by Eleanor Morgan. This one was very kindly gifted to me a few months ago by my friend Shar, so thank you so much, Shar. If you've been around this channel a little while, you may know that one of my favorite topics to read about, especially in terms of nonfiction, is like all things to do with like gender and sexuality. I read a lot about sex and relationships. I have read a lot of books that are about periods. I love talking about all of that kind of stuff. I love learning more about bodies and sex, about relationships. I read a lot of books that are about periods. These are all topics that I love discussing and I love reading about and I love learning more about. And this is a book that is all about bodies and health, and specifically related to hormones. The book begins with discussing periods, but it ends up exploring a lot of things in relation to hormones, experiences of pain and pleasure, both physically and emotionally. It explores mental health. It looks at how people's responses to situations, whether it's a physical response or an emotional response, can so often be dismissed as someone just being hormonal. It takes a look at the historical ideas behind madness and hysteria and how they are linked to hormones. I have read a lot of books around these kinds of topics that are about sex and orgasm and the vagina. I've read books that are about periods, but it was so interesting to see it from an angle that is so specifically to do with hormones. My one major criticism of this book, however, is quite a significant one, and that is it's really not inclusive of trans experiences in any way. Like, when the author is talking about periods, when she's talking about periods, she does it in quite an essentialist way, whereby it's like women have periods and that's a universal truth. It's simply not the case. There are some women who don't have periods for a plethora of reasons, and there are some trans men who do have periods. There are non-binary people who have periods. This is not just a woman issue. Admittedly, a lot of the research around these kinds of things are focused on cisgender women, but I do think it's important to acknowledge the trans experience when you're talking about these kinds of topics. And also, I find it very strange that the book that is about hormones at no point acknowledges the trans experience. Hormone replacement therapy is very briefly touched on in this book, but only in relation to the menopause. There is no mention of it in terms of like trans people. And I'm sure, you know, the topic of hormones and the trans experience could be an entire book on its own, and I'm not necessarily saying this author is the best person to speak to that experience by any means, but I just find it very odd that it wasn't acknowledged at any point, and in fact I found it really disappointing. I do still think this is a really great book. I did get a lot from this book, I did learn a lot from it, but I do just find it disappointing that that wasn't acknowledged at any point. It's still a book that I would really recommend if you are interested in these kinds of topics, but the fact that trans-inclusive language wasn't really used throughout, it's just a shame. The next book I want to talk about is Gay Bar by Jeremy Atherton Lynn. This is a memoir, but it's also kind of like a history of the gay bar, of this kind of cultural phenomenon and the origins of gay bars, what they were like in the 70s, 80s, 90s up to the present day, and the significant role that they played in the queer community, for better or for worse. And I think in this book the author does an incredible job of exploring how important and positive these places could be, but also the damage that could be done in them. It explores gay bars being places that are messy and contradictory. In some ways this book is a memoir, in some ways this book is a history of gay bars, but also somehow it's all of those things and more. It looks at queer culture in London, in San Francisco, in Los Angeles. I think it's phenomenally written, and if you are interested in queer culture, in queer history, then I think this is an absolutely fantastic book. I also read The 7 Kinds of People You Meet in a Bookshop by Sean Bethel. Sean has written a few books on his experiences of being a bookseller. I have read his first one, The Diary of a Bookseller, and I really enjoyed it. You know, as someone who works in the book trade, I work in publishing now, but I also used to be a bookseller. There were just a lot of things that I found really funny about this book. It is a really brief book where the author is just kind of joking about the different kinds of customers that he has come across over the years. The kind of quirks that they have, the annoying habits that they have, the fantastic moments that he has had as a bookseller. There's not too much more to say about it other than that. You know, if you are someone who has spent a lot of time in bookshops or you've been a bookseller yourself, then I think there's a lot of humour to be found in this book. I definitely enjoyed it. The poetry collection that I read in April was Who is Mary Sue by Sophie Collins. A lot of you may be familiar with the concept of a Mary Sue, you know, a character that is seen as a female author just kind of self-inserting an idealized version of themselves into their writing. And while his poetry collection does engage with that idea and a criticism of that idea, it does it in quite an abstract way. I kind of anticipated it to deal with it in a more direct manner. A lot of the poems in this kind of washed over me, and I don't feel like I personally got a lot from them in terms of either, you know, it giving me something to think about or even just on a surface level enjoyment. It's not really the style of poetry that I get on with. It's very lyrical. There are a lot of parts of this book that are more like lyrical essays than they are poems. To me, this did feel quite disjointed, and I think it's a collection that really has to be considered as one piece rather than there being individual poems, I think, that are standout or fantastic. I don't really have too many thoughts on it other than that. I think I would have enjoyed a collection that dealt with this kind of topic of the Mary Sue, the ideas around women just writing about their own experiences, just writing about themselves. I think I would have enjoyed something that dealt with that in a more direct manner and a less abstract manner. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend this book, but I wouldn't say that it's like a bad book either. It just wasn't really the poetry collection from me. How you doing? Have you made it this far? Do you need a break to get like some more snacks, get another brew? Like, I can wait. Let's move on to the kids' books. I'm going to talk about some picture books first of all. All of these were very kindly sent to me by Little Tiger, and two of them I'm going to talk about them in tandem. So we have The Girls and The Boys by Lauren Ace and Jenny Lawley. So I had read The Girls previously, but I'd never owned a physical copy of it, so I was really excited to reread it and also read the new release from this picture book partnership, The Boys. In both of these books, we are following a set of 4 friends. As they grow up, the friendship between them, the different interests that all of these kids have, the different struggles that they face, the different paths their lives take into adulthood. Both of these picture books are so tenderly told. The illustrations are completely gorgeous, and they're really illustrations that add so much to the words, and there is so many interesting things to look at in the illustration. There is so much diversity in the characters. These are picture books that are LGBT plus friendly in such a seamlessly and wonderfully integrated way, and there is a link between the little girls in The Girls and the little boys in The Boys that I think is just it's such a nice touch to these books. They are completely beautiful. If you have a young person in your life, I would very highly recommend them, but I got so much out of them as a grown-up reader. Next, I have A Turtle Rescue by Johnny Marks and Kwan Lee. While this is a picture book, it is definitely for slightly older readers, more confident readers, as there is quite a lot of text in this. In this picture book, we are following 2 explorers named Flora and Fauna who are just trying to enjoy their holiday. However, when the sea turtles stop laying their eggs on the golden sands nearby, they are called into action to investigate. Throughout this book, we are learning so much about the ocean and the different creatures that there are in the ocean. The illustrations are absolutely stunning. We learn so much about the environment, about caring for animals. There are so many facts included about these creatures, about the biodiversity that there is in the ocean as we follow along with the narrative of this story. There are also little cutouts in the pages and fold-out flaps, so there's a really tactile, immersive experience for a reader as well. I think this is just such an incredible reading experience for a child and really does a great job of bridging that gap between them reading quite simplistic picture books to something that is more text heavy. 2 more books that I'm going to talk about in tandem are A Sprinkle of Sorcery and A Tangle of Spells, both by Michelle Harrison. These are the second and third books in the Widdershins series, which begins with Pinch of Magic. I read the first book in this series back in January and really enjoyed it, so I was really keen to read books 2 and 3 as well. In these books, we are following the 3 Widdershins sisters that all have really distinct personalities. I think when you're reading these books, it's really fun to think about which of the Widdershins sisters you would be. I don't want to spoil anything about A Pinch of Magic, so I will leave the plot descriptions where they are. And what I'd like to talk about when reviewing these books is more like the atmosphere and setting of these books. All of these books capture an atmosphere that I think I find so enjoyable about middle grade. Just that sense of like something is not quite right. There is something going on. You know that there are secrets to uncover. You are following along with your main characters as they realize more and more about the world that they live in. There is creative and wonderful magical elements. There are absolutely wonderful characters in these books, and there is just the right amount of peril and danger as well. And ultimately at the heart of these books is the relationship and bond between these 3 sisters, and I love reading about sisterhood. These books are just genuinely funny as well. Like, even reading them as a grown-up, I just found them so thoroughly entertaining. In April, I also read Nothing Ever Happens Here by Sarah Hager Holt. I thought this middle grade book was just so fantastic. In this book, we follow Izzy and her family and what happens when Izzy's dad comes out as a transgender woman. The book is about how Izzy and her siblings come to understand that, the questions that they have around it, the confusions that they have around it, just their different responses to finding out this new information. And the 3 siblings react in very different ways, and their responses to it kind of fluctuate throughout the book. Suddenly it feels like there is a huge spotlight on this family that before wasn't really that noticeable or interesting to anyone. And amongst that, Izzy is also dealing with, tensions in her friendship group. She is dealing with teasing in school. She is dealing with boys being something that is on her radar for the first time. I thought this book was really fantastic and dealt with these topics in a way that was accessible and understandable for its intended audience. The author herself is not trans, but she does talk about the research that she has done for this book, and I think it is such a warm and hopeful story. This author does have another book out now called proud of me, which I'm really excited to read as well. In April, I also read When the World Was Ours by Liz Kessler. This is an historical YA novel, but I think there is so much in here that an adult readership would really appreciate as well. We are following a group of 3 children who begin the novel as friends, but their lives go off in very different directions when the Second World War breaks out. Their lives go off in different directions, quite literally, in terms of the locations that they move to, but also the way that the war affects them. There are some incredibly heart-wrenching moments in this book that are difficult to read, and one of the things that I think is so incredible about this book is that it was actually inspired by the author's father and his own life story. And I think one of the things that is so important when reading a novel like this is not only remembering that these were things that actually happened and experiences that children went through, but there are now children that are fleeing war-torn countries in our modern day. I think this is a really important book. And the final book I'm going to talk to you about today is Rules for Being a Girl. I really enjoyed this YA novel. It's a novel that is all about experiences of misogyny and sexism in high school. We're following our main character as she is kind of introduced to feminism, and she begins to realise all of the injustices that there are in her school, all of the different elements of misogyny. And the catalyst for her realising this is when her English teacher, who is seen as like one of the cool young teachers, tries to initiate a very inappropriate relationship with her. This is something that, despite her publicly saying what he did to her, he initially doesn't face any repercussions for it. It's about our main character trying to get on with her life when that act has gone unpunished for him. And I think that was done really well in this book, where it depicted the reality of when things like this happen, women aren't always believed. And it depicted that as a reality. But the conclusion of the novel was very satisfying, and how the issue was eventually dealt with, I think it was just balanced really well between being realistic but also encouraging women to speak out if they feel safe to. Following this teenage girl coming to terms with what happened to her, discovering feminism for the first time, is also juxtaposed with conflicts in her friendship group. It is juxtaposed with a new romance for her, and I loved the dynamic between her and her romantic interest in this book. They also start a feminist book club in this novel, so I love the idea of like a teenage girl reading this book and coming away with it with more books to read based on like what they're reading in the book club. Really difficult topics handled in this book in a really fantastic way, and I would very highly recommend it. There we go, we did it. That is all of the books that I read in April. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 21 books. I think it was 21 books. As ever, all of the books that I've mentioned will be linked down below in the description if you want to find out more about them. If you've read any of these books, I would love to hear your thoughts on them down below in the comments. Oh wait, we've got one more thing to do before I go. My unread TBR. At the end of this wrap up, my physical TBR stands at 106 books. I did say if it wasn't fewer than 100 books, then I would start unhauling things. Are there 6 books that I want to unhaul? There are a couple that I think, yes, I do want to unhaul, but I'm not sure if there's 6. And here's the thing, right? Unless I completely fuck up, my TBR will be fewer than 100 books at the end of May. There may be an unhaul video coming to you later this month. Maybe. We'll see. Just leave it with me. But we've had a long day. We've just reviewed 21 books. I can't go on hauling books now. That's just too much effort for right now. We will reconvene at a later date. We will regroup and we'll see what happens. That is all I'm going to talk about today. I hope you guys are doing well, and I will speak to you in my next video.